Welcome back. I'm joined by two more Talmidei Chachamim, Rabbi Daniel Wolf and Rabbi Amalia Haas, who are here to answer your questions. It's time now for you to get into the conversation. The chat is open for your questions. For those of you who are using the closed captions, please open up the chat as a separate window, and that will keep the constant comments in the chat from covering up the closed captioning. While you write your questions, I'm going to reflect for 60 seconds on what we just saw, and then turn the floor over to Rabbi Wolf and Rabbi Haas for their reflections. I want to say three things. First of all, I recant nothing. I heard no unanswerable challenges, and I'm still convinced that what I said is the halacha. But that may not be relevant, because the obvious fact remains, and this is the second point, that nobody likes austerity measures. Not rabbis, not anybody. Maybe that's the prophetic voice that Rav Benny critiqued. My desire to impose halachic austerity measures on the Jews. And as Rav Shurlo commented, even if I was able to prove my point beyond doubt, it is unlikely that that halacha would be kept. Finally, I want to point out that each of the respondents only addressed the isurim, the prohibitions. No one addressed the chiyuv, the obligation to work to solve the climate crisis. That might be my fault for dealing with the isurim at such length and detail compared to the chiyuv. Still, I'd like to think that even if the isurim are cast aside, the chiyuv remains. We have an obligation, people. Let's get on it. It's my pleasure now to introduce Rabbi Daniel Wolf. Rav Wolf was a Ram at Yeshivat Har Tzion for over 30 years, lecturing in the Kolel Gavoa there. He was the senior editor for Rav Lichtenstein's Lectures on the Talmud, which won the Israel Prize, and wrote 3 books on the Talmud. He is a renowned expert on various fields of halacha, including tum'ah and ribit. The interface of halacha and the modern world is also an interest of his research, and he has delivered lectures on various modern halachic topics. Rav Wolf, what is your reflection on what's been said so far?
First of all, I'd like to, let me just say amen to all the praises that Rabbi Resnikoff gathered. Beyond that, I think the discussion of Grum and Garmi sort of missed the boat, and that although there's an incredible amount of material on the definition of Grum and Garmi, that doesn't mean that it's allowed. Most of the discussion is whether it creates a chiyuv, an obligation to pay post facto. That doesn't imply anything about whether it's mutar. And obviously, the Gemara even says that even though grama b'nizikin is patur, it's chayiv b'dei shamayim, that there's a moral obligation to give restitution. Obviously, if there's a moral obligation to restitute, even though it's not enforceable in a court, obviously it's not allowed. What's not clear is how far can that prohibition go? And that's not clear. As far as what Rabbi Bigman said about Nizkei Shchenim, I think a lot of global warming, Nizkei Shchenim has to do with something that I'm doing in my Dal Ramot, in my property. Transportation is public, electric generation is public. So all those things have nothing to do with Nizkei Shchenim. As far as the Heter of Derech Eretz, I found I'm more nonplussed by that issue as well. I would like to, I think Rabbanit Michal mentioned this Gemara, and I think this is a central thing. We have a Gemara that Asar Tznaim Hitna Yoshua, that Yoshua made 10 conditions, and much of it is about the use of Rishut Rabim. One of those even refers to water usage. And that, I think, that shows, and the Gemara expands that those conditions also exist in Chutz La'aretz, not only Tisa La'aretz in Israel, but everywhere in the world, so that there seems to be a responsibility, a policy responsibility of government and society to protect the world and to make it a productive place. 2 other sources which I think could be quoted. The Gemara quotes the pasuk in Yeshayahu, Lo tohu lo notzar ha'olam, lo nivra ha'olam, the world was not created, Ela b'shvil pru urvu, Shenemar lo tohu b'ra'ah l'shavet yitzhara. The world was not created for chaos, but for man to dwell within. And that is why the world was created, and therefore we have different obligations based on that. But the theme being that man has responsibility not to allow the world to devolve into chaos. In addition, also we have another pasuk which is more midrashic, but I think it can be also expanded on, where after the Mabul it says lo. It says "Shichet kol basar darko la'aretz." All flesh or all living beings have destroyed the world, have ruined the world. And the Gemara and the Medrash and the Rabbah talks about that even when I plant one growth, another growth comes up. So there's obviously some kind of notion of destroying the world. And of course, one can quibble whether that applies to cloning or, but I think in the extreme example of global warming, where we do see a serious deterioration in the conditions of the earth, that would be included. As far as a person, so I would say definitely that there's, I would echo what Rabbi Resnikoff quoted in terms of a pearl of there being a societal commendation. The specific recommendations, both in society and the personal, is I find difficult to delineate exactly what the thermostat on our houses should be, how big houses we should have. People talked about electric cars, how big cars we should have, how much effort should I take to take mass transit rather than my car. All those technical details are extremely difficult for me to divine, and obviously let's say a halting of all tourism would really bring catastrophic economic effects on certain countries. So I'm deigned to, categorically answer certain things. I think the economic, if someone would actually listen to the psak, or if many people would listen to the psak, it would cause incredible economic dislocation. And I would prefer, I think most of it is on the public policy level. I do find it difficult to decide on specific policy recommendations.
Thank
Yeah, I do. Rabbi Linzer asked whether I'm not sure. I mean, the problem is, as I say, I think it's obvious that there is damaging public goods per se. I think that's what I quoted, that there is a responsibility on society to protect the world, both for its people and for the world itself. I find it difficult to translate that principle into specific recommendations. I have some in mind, but
Thanks, Rav Wolf. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I think electrical generation and renewable energy, and obviously cars should be in the forefront. Other things like meat and other kinds of technological advances seem to be necessary as well. I find it difficult to really, a halachic thing to propose X more than Y. I would be more for looking for it's called the low-hanging fruit, but that's for economists and policymakers to do more.
Thank you. Thank you, Rav Wolf, for that analysis. It's once again a pleasure to introduce Rabbi Amalia Haas. Rabbi Haas teaches at the intersection of Judaism, food justice, and mindfulness. An experiential educator and organic beekeeper, Rabbi Amalia has a passion for climate advocacy and Jewish honeybee education. Through her company, Be Awesome, she facilitates professional development programs and retreats grounded in Judaism, creativity, and nature. She sells raw honey for Rosh Hashanah and year-round. She is the Rabbah of the Bees at the Shalom Institute in Malibu, California. She's active with Chazon, Green Faith, and the Jewish Farmer Network. Rabbi Amalia was ordained in 2020 by Yeshivat Maharat's Advanced Kollel Executive Ordination Track and received recently completed a chaplaincy residency with the Cleveland Clinic. Previous education includes Machon Pardes, Matan, She'arim, Yeshiva University, and Oberlin College. She lives in Beechwood, Ohio with her husband, 6 children, and many bees. Rabbi Haas, your reflections?
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with such a caring audience and so many of my teachers. So my thinking has really looked at how we can start to have a change of consciousness to figure out how to differently apply halakha in this time of unprecedented sort of cataclysmic change. And I think it's important to notice that what we're talking about here isn't a Jewish problem. It's really a human consciousness problem. You know, when I'm driving in the suburbs in Ohio, do I realize that I'm causing global warming? It's not something that's in my consciousness moment by moment. And in my view, a kind of halachic formalism won't get us all the way to where we need to go. And so what I've reached for is sort of infusing that halakha with theology. And one of the texts that I've found most powerful for doing this is Shabbat 154b, where there's this story, again, Haggai mentioned that I'm a beekeeper, of Rabban Gamliel's donkey who's laden with honey, and Rabban Gamliel doesn't want to unload the donkey over Shabbat, and waits until the end of Shabbat, and then the donkey dies. And I think it's a very powerful metaphor for what we are sort of, experiencing with the climate. There's definitely sound reasoning supporting Rav Gamliel for not unloading the animal, but the text finally asks, isn't there an issue of tsa'ar ba'alei chayim, causing the suffering of animals here? And that's what I hear in most of our respondents is, how do we touch the bigger picture, even if we face halachic categories that don't seem to connect directly enough. Grama, there's too many levels of grama to say that there's actually an obligation. So for me, what seems particularly fruitful is what Rabbanit Tikochinsky was talking about in terms of the Reshut HaRabim, and really looking at that broader impact on the planet, if you view it as, really the public good being impacted here. Also, when Rav Linzer was speaking about end of life decisions, that it's a different way of framing entirely the question, and looking at the earth as not ours, but really as God's, and that it's not in our right to be masic the public good. So I think for me those are very powerful approaches. I guess one other thing I just wanted to say, as someone who's a leader in the environmental movement, is that part of what's been fascinating for me is the kind of questions that I've been approached with since very recently receiving smicha in the last year from Maharat. And it's been, really interesting to be approached by people from within the Jewish environmental movement who are not necessarily halachic in their observance, but they're coming to me with these sorts of questions. So some of them have to do with trade-offs. There are people saying, should I take the path of personal self-deprivation because it'll decrease global warming, if I give up meat entirely, if I give up, driving a car. And as I've been sifting through sources, part of what I've been looking at is not so much encouraging people on a strict path of self-deprivation, but rather to think in terms of, tithing towards fighting global warming.
Rabbi, one
yeah.
more minute.
Yes. Yeah. Or something like, changing the broader norms of the community. For example, moving towards having smaller weddings rather than really large ones. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to stop. I want to get to the questions.
Yeah.
And maybe that we have a little more time. The first question, I think there are lots of fascinating questions and comments in the chat. The one that I want to get to first is a question from Ms. Talia Laster, who asks as follows. I'm curious how or if the halacha of public domain and damages delineates responsibilities between people with greater or fewer financial resources, i.e. do the rich people have more of a chiyuv? And I would say on the other side, maybe more of an isser. Rabbi Amalia, what are your thoughts?
It's a great question. I need to marinate in that for a minute.
Rav Wolf, any thoughts?
Yes, one of the ironic parts of global warming is that it's really reverse. Unfortunately, the wealthier classes pollute much, much more, both in terms of country. I think I actually looked it up for the conference. America emits close to 20, per capita, emits close to 20 metric tons per person per year. This is in 2000, as of 2018. I assume it's a tad higher now. India, for example, pollutes 2.5 metric tons per capita per year. So it's actually quite reversed. In general, in halacha, there is a consideration given to the amount of financial capability in terms of doing a mitzvah essay, in terms of obligations rather than prohibitions between the wealthy and the not so wealthy. But of course, if we were talking in terms of some kind of a weaker standard, not like an Isser of being Michal Shabbos or eating not kosher, but taking reasonable steps to limit our carbon footprint. So what would be considered reasonable would obviously be dependent on the level of hardship. So on the whole, it's sort of the baseline is really reversed, that wealthy countries and classes are much bigger polluters and consumers of energy than poorer people, but that yes, I think greater demands can be made on the richer countries and the richer individuals in terms of applying the rules that almost all the speakers, Rabbi Resnikoff and all the speakers, talked about reasonable steps. Well, what's reasonable? What kind of hardship? So if someone would cut their income by 10%, and that would mean, they can't take as many vacations, that might be more reasonable than someone cutting 10% would mean that they would have cut down on the food or medical care available to them.
Thank you. Rabbi, have you had a chance?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just echo that, in poorer countries, there's so much of living, hand to mouth. And these kinds of considerations are really not available to people that are living on that level of poverty. And all through our sources, you can see that there's always distinctions that are made between the resources of the wealthy and the poor. So
I'll just add my 2 cents, which is to say this fits into my question of tzorach gadol. And this is almost what Rav Wolf said, so I won't take very long with it, but the tzorach gadol means something different. I should translate tzorach gadol, an important need. Mm-hmm. What an important need, how much money somebody who has a lot of money needs is, I think, a different question than how much money for somebody who's hand to mouth. That gets to another question that somebody asked, which is, well, do we have to ask rabbis all the time about this? Or is this a constant shaila, a question that we have to ask? And I would suggest that In cases where it's a judgment call, then yes. In cases where it's a real question of like, are you going to stop massive amounts of pollution, and you think you don't have to, I think that's a good time to go to a rabbi and see if he thinks that it's he or she thinks that it's Torah Gadol. I'll add so one other question that caught my eye, and that's the question of rodef. Can people who are endangering millions be thought of as rodef, as somebody who is essentially pursuing someone with the intention of endangering them and ultimately ending their lives? Any thoughts on that, Rav Wolf?
Well, in rodef itself, I think there's sort of two levels. There's one level of rodef, which is sort of an extrajudicial kind of punishment, and that requires a kind of culpability or a real intent to damage, or in the case of rodef, to injure. There's another secondary rodef, which is, causing one's harm. So as far as the first thing, I think that's obvious that doesn't apply. The second one, that there are certain cases where even without personal culpability, some of the rules of rodef could be applied. The phrase in the Gemara is "Meshamaya karad filei," someone by his being itself is dangerous. It might theoretically be applicable, but I think the chaos that would be affected, that anyone who decides that Exxon or General Motors is emitting too much pollutants, let me assassinate the CEO of these companies, the chaos in society would be way outweigh the gains in possibly assassinating captains of industry. So I wouldn't be a proponent. I don't think it's a good idea.
Thank you. Rabbi Amalia.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this a fair amount. I think it is tough to use rodef in this line of argument. I will say, though, that I think that when society starts, when in political discussions, if there's a massive oil spill, Nigeria was on the front page of the Times today, when there's public outcry and a view that there's a company or a country that really is causing tremendous suffering, then it almost seems foolish, at least not to discuss the notion of rodef, not necessarily to say that it applies, but like our the rabbis and shuls should be talking about it, because there is an ethical, it's an ethical problem. But I agree, I think it's tough to utilize it from a halachic standpoint.